The winter air of December 1983 carried a brutal chill that pressed against the walls of the Richmond FBI field office. The building stood mostly dark, its fluorescent lights humming only on the upper floors where paperwork and late-night disputes often outlasted the workday. Michael Carver walked the corridor alone, coat draped over his arm, his jaw tight with the remnants of an argument that had ended minutes earlier. His superior, Assistant Director Paul Harrington, had dismissed him with clipped words and a hard glare. "You've said enough, Carver. Go home." But Michael knew the silence behind those words spoke louder than the dismissal itself. Something wasn't right. He stepped into the cold night, breath fogging in front of him, and walked toward the empty parking lot. His sedan sat beneath a flickering lamppost, a pale halo cutting across the hood. Michael unlocked the door, slid inside, and sat for a long moment without starting the engine. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale, while his eyes drifted to the payphone across the lot. He finally reached for a quarter. The phone rang 3 times before Laura answered. Her voice carried sleep, irritation, and worry. "Michael? Do you know what time it is?" He hesitated, gaze fixed on the building behind him. "I'll be home soon," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Just keep the door locked tonight." "Why are you whispering?" "What's going on?" Michael closed his eyes. "Nothing. Just promise me, Laura." There was a silence on the line, broken only by Laura's uneasy sigh. "You're scaring me. I'll explain when I get home." His words were firm, though he didn't sound like a man sure of himself. "Kiss Danny for me. Tell him I'll see him in the morning." The line went dead. Michael leaned against the phone booth, exhaling sharply. He looked over his shoulder one last time, as though expecting someone to emerge from the building, then returned to his car. The engine turned over with a metallic groan, headlights slicing through the dark as he pulled out of the lot. The roads were empty, the night thick and restless. Pines flanked the highway like watchmen, their shadows spilling across the asphalt. Michael's mind churned with fragments, files missing from the archives, names redacted in reports that should have been transparent, Harrington's sudden hostility. For weeks he had felt a tightening net around him. Tonight it felt strangling. Miles from the city, he slowed at an intersection where the road bent toward the backcountry. He tapped the steering wheel, debating. Home lay to the west, but he turned east, toward solitude, toward answers. The further he drove, the quieter the world became. No cars, no lights, just the hum of his engine and the faint buzz of the radio, static bleeding between stations. He rolled down the window, letting the freezing air whip his face, grounding him in the reality that he wasn't imagining the danger. At 1:47 a.m., a passing trucker spotted a dark sedan pulled onto the shoulder near mile marker 76. The driver's side door hung open, dome light glowing faintly. A thermos sat in the cup holder, still warm when touched. Papers littered the passenger seat. The keys dangled in the ignition, but Michael Carver was nowhere. When police arrived minutes later, they found no footprints in the frosted grass, no signs of struggle, no blood. Just a car abandoned on the edge of nowhere, as if the driver had stepped out and evaporated into the night. By sunrise, word spread through the Richmond field office. Whispers rose like smoke. An agent gone missing was rare. An agent vanishing without a trace was unthinkable. Harrington gave his statement briskly, almost coldly, before shutting his office door. Laura Carver sat at home, robe clutched tight, waiting for a knock that came before dawn. 2 agents stood on her porch, hats in hand, voices heavy with practiced sympathy. "Ma'am, we need to talk about your husband." And just like that, the Carver family's life split into before and after. What began as one man's long night at work would unravel into years of silence, rumors, and a mystery that refused to be buried. The knock at the door that morning shattered the fragile rhythm of Laura Carver's life. She opened it expecting Michael's tired smile, maybe even an apology for coming home so late. Instead, she was met with 2 somber men in dark coats, their breath visible in the cold dawn. "Mrs. Carver," one of them said softly, removing his hat, "we need to talk." Laura gripped the doorframe, the world tilting beneath her. Daniel, only 8 years old, shuffled into the hallway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He froze when he saw the men, sensing instinctively that something was wrong. Inside, the agents explained what they knew, which was almost nothing. Michael's car had been found abandoned on the side of a rural road. The engine was still running, keys in the ignition, personal effects intact. No sign of foul play, no sign of him, just absence. Laura listened in silence, her fingers trembling around the edge of her coffee mug. Finally, she whispered, "You're telling me he's just gone?" The older agent's face hardened. "We'll do everything we can, ma'am. The Bureau takes care of its own." But Laura noticed the glance the two men exchanged, brief and telling. It wasn't reassurance, it was resignation. The days that followed blurred into each other. Reporters swarmed the front lawn, cameras flashing, voices calling Michael a missing hero one moment and speculating about double lives the next. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, whispering as Laura carried groceries inside or walked Daniel to school. Inside the house, silence pressed down like a weight. Michael's suit still hung in the closet. His shaving kit still rested on the bathroom counter. Laura refused to move anything, convinced he would walk through the door any moment and complain about the mess. But the door stayed closed. By the end of the week, rumors had already started. Laura heard them in the grocery store checkout line, in whispered phone calls from relatives. That Michael had been seeing someone else, that he was under investigation, that he'd staged his own disappearance. Laura wanted to scream, to defend him. But late at night, when Daniel was asleep and the house creaked with emptiness, doubt slithered in. She replayed his last call in her head, his voice low, urgent, whispering for her to lock the door. He had promised to explain. But what if the explanation was worse than the silence? At school, Daniel fought with classmates who parroted what their parents read in the papers. "Your dad's a traitor," one boy sneered. Daniel bloodied his nose. Laura was called to the principal's office, where Daniel sat with fists clenched, tears brimming in his eyes. "He's not a traitor," Daniel muttered when they drove home. "He's not." Laura gripped the steering wheel, trying not to cry. "Of course he's not," she said, but her voice cracked, betraying her. That night, Daniel asked if his dad would be back before Christmas. Laura tucked him in, brushing hair from his forehead. She wanted to lie to soothe him, but the truth hung heavy between them. "I don't know," she whispered. "I just don't know." Weeks turned into months. The Bureau issued a statement declaring Michael Carver officially missing. Leads dwindled, search parties thinned. Eventually, the case was folded into the archives under a single word that burned Laura's eyes when she read it. Unsolved. Life, for the Carvers, became a daily ritual of pretending. Pretending not to hear the whispers. Pretending not to notice the empty chair at dinner. Pretending they were whole when they were anything but. For Laura, grief mixed with anger and anger with betrayal. She didn't know whether to mourn her husband or curse his name. For Daniel, the absence grew into an obsession, a hollow space he would spend years trying to fill. And as winter melted into spring, the world moved on. But the Carvers never did. By the summer of 1984, the posters had begun to yellow. Rain had streaked the ink, blurring Michael Carver's face into something ghost-like. The FBI still kept his photo on the bulletin board at the Richmond field office, but everyone knew it was only a formality. New cases filled the board. New names demanded attention. The search for Michael had slipped into silence. Laura felt it most in the phone calls that stopped coming. At first, agents checked in daily, updating her with leads. A sighting in Baltimore, a tip from a gas station clerk, a vague story about a man resembling Michael boarding a bus to Chicago. Each lead ended the same way, dead. By spring, the calls came once a week. By summer, once a month. By Christmas, not at all. The Bureau never said it aloud, but Laura understood. Michael's case was no longer urgent. The community turned. In church pews and grocery aisles, Laura felt eyes burning against her. Some pitied her, offering hushed condolences. Others were sharper, asking pointed questions about Michael's fidelity, about money, about secrets he might have kept. Men like him, they always have another life, one neighbor whispered when she thought Laura couldn't hear. Laura clenched her jaw, holding Daniel's hand tighter as they walked past. She wanted to believe her husband had been an honest man. But the silence of the Bureau, the whispers of infidelity, and the memory of his strange last phone call gnawed at her in ways grief alone could not. Daniel carried the absence differently. At school, he grew quieter, folding into himself. Teachers said he drifted during lessons, eyes fixed on the window as though waiting for a car to pull into the parking lot. He stopped inviting friends over, embarrassed by the cameras that still occasionally appeared on their lawn, chasing stories long gone stale. One night, Laura found him in Michael's study, sitting in his father's chair, leafing through old case files Michael had left behind. She froze in the doorway, her heart clenching. "What are you doing in here?" Daniel looked up, eyes wet but determined. "I want to know what he was working on. Maybe that's why he's gone." Laura crossed the room, kneeling beside him. "That's not for you to carry, sweetheart. You're just a kid." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I'm not a kid anymore," Laura didn't argue. She only pulled him into her arms, both of them trembling under the weight of what Michael had left behind. By 1986, the file officially closed. The Bureau's language was cold, clinical. Carver, Michael. Status missing, presumed dead. Laura read the letter 3 times before shredding it. She refused to let her husband be reduced to a status. He was a man who tucked Daniel in at night, who left his coffee unfinished on the counter, who whispered secrets into the phone hours before he disappeared. He was more than a line in a forgotten report, but she also knew the Bureau was finished with him, so she buried the grief beneath routine. Work, chores, meals, sleep. Every day is identical, every day a performance of survival. Only at night, when the house was silent, did the facade break. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if Michael was alive somewhere or if he had chosen to abandon them. Years passed. Daniel grew taller, his voice deepened, his questions sharpened. Why didn't they try harder? Why don't they care? Laura never had answers. She only told him what she needed to believe. Because they couldn't find him. Not because they didn't care. But even as she spoke the words, she didn't believe them. By 1990, Michael Carver's disappearance had become nothing more than a footnote in FBI history, a mystery locked away in dusty boxes, buried under fresher scandals and newer tragedies. Yet for Laura and Daniel, the cold trail was not an ending. It was a wound that refused to heal, one that would resurface when they least expected it. The year was 1991 when Laura first heard Elena's name. It came casually, almost carelessly, from a retired agent during a memorial service for another fallen colleague. The man had been reminiscing over whiskey, his voice low, his words slurred with drink. Carver. He was a hell of an agent, but he got too close to someone he shouldn't have. Laura froze. What do you mean? The man blinked, realizing he'd said too much, and muttered, "Forget it." But Laura never did. That night she lay awake, replaying the phrase, "Too close to someone he shouldn't have." The seed of suspicion burrowed into her, poisoning what fragile memories of Michael she had left. Years earlier, back in 1982, Michael Carver had been assigned to monitor a high-value informant linked to organized crime families in Maryland. The informant's handler was a woman named Elena Rui, a civilian asset who worked as a translator and intermediary. Michael first met her in a diner on the outskirts of Baltimore, the kind of place where the jukebox still played old country ballads and the waitresses called everyone honey. Elena was striking, not in a polished way, but with a quiet intensity that drew people in. Dark hair, sharp eyes, and a calm that seemed to see straight through Michael's practiced professionalism. Their meeting was meant to be brief, transactional, but it stretched past midnight. Michael found himself talking more than listening, confessing small details he never shared with colleagues, his frustration with bureau politics, the suffocating bureaucracy, the gnawing sense that corruption lurked beneath the surface. Elena listened without judgment. "You sound like a man carrying more weight than one pair of shoulders can hold," she said softly. Michael smiled bitterly. "Sometimes it feels that way." That night something shifted. Their encounters multiplied, first under the guise of work, then with excuses that blurred into secrecy. Coffee became dinner. Dinner became nights where Michael lingered too long, ignoring his watch, forgetting the world outside. Elena was dangerous not because she was reckless, but because she offered him something he hadn't felt in years: understanding. She didn't see him as an agent, a husband, or a provider. She saw the cracks beneath, the man who questioned his orders and feared the silence in his own home. But forbidden connections always demand a cost. By late 1983, their relationship had grown into a secret Michael could no longer control. He returned home to Laura with guilt etched into his posture, his kisses colder, his distance more obvious. Laura noticed, of course, wives always notice, but she mistook it for the weight of his cases, the late nights, the endless bureaucracy of the bureau. One evening, Elena pressed him. "Do you ever think about walking away from it all? Leaving the bureau? Starting over somewhere no one knows your name?" Michael looked at her across the dimly lit motel room, the air heavy with smoke from the cigarette she'd just lit. "And then what? Pretend none of it happened?" "You wouldn't be pretending," Elena said. "You'd be free," Michael shook his head. "Freedom doesn't come that easily. Not in my world." Still, her words lingered. When Elena disappeared in late November 1983, days before Michael himself vanished, the Bureau quietly scrubbed her from reports. Officially, she had no significant role. Unofficially, whispers spread that she had ties to men the Bureau couldn't touch, that her loyalty was never to them, but to secrets buried in the underbelly of organized crime. Michael knew too much. About her. About Harrington. About the cases that disappeared from files overnight. And then, just like Elena, Michael was gone. For Laura, the discovery of Elena's name years later was like reopening a wound that had never healed. Had Michael truly been kidnapped, silenced for what he knew, or had he chosen another life, another woman, leaving his family behind? Daniel, overhearing fragments of the conversation one night, demanded answers. Was Dad in love with her? His voice trembled with anger and betrayal. Laura had no reply. She could only sit in silence, staring at the photo on the mantel, wondering if the man she had married had been a stranger all along. By 1990, most people had stopped speaking Michael Carver's name. But Frank Delaney had not. Delaney had been Michael's colleague, sometimes rival, and, on rare nights when whiskey loosened their guarded tongues, a friend. He remembered Michael as a man of contradictions, diligent yet restless, loyal yet suspicious of the very institution they both served. When the Bureau closed the file on Michael's disappearance, Delaney felt something gnawing at him, an unfinished sentence that demanded completion. Now, retired early after a bullet to the hip ended his career, Delaney had time and nothing to lose. It began with whispers. He heard them in bars where former agents drank away their pensions, in dim hallways of courthouses where old cases still clung like dust. Michael had been digging into irregularities, Delaney was told. Missing funds, altered transcripts, surveillance operations that never made it into official logs. The more Delaney listened, the more he realized how many people wanted Michael's name erased. One night, in a bar off Route 1, Delaney pressed an ex-analyst who once worked under Harrington. The man shook his head, voice dropping low. Carver got close to something he shouldn't have. Not just mob families. Something inside. Delaney narrowed his eyes. Inside the Bureau? The man didn't answer. He simply drained his glass, stood, and left. Delaney kept digging. He drove to storage units in Maryland, to county courthouses where dusty boxes of testimony were stacked like forgotten tombstones. He found threads, small, almost invisible, that seemed to connect Michael's cases with Elena Ruiz. Elena's name had been deliberately purged from several files, yet here and there it remained in margins in scrawled handwriting that clerks had missed. A witness who was never officially logged. An informant who appeared, then disappeared. Delaney knew bureau tricks well enough. Files didn't erase themselves. Someone had gone in and cleaned them, but not perfectly. As he pieced the scraps together, one truth unsettled him most. Michael had been preparing a report, a detailed memo on internal corruption, just weeks before he vanished. According to a secretary Delaney tracked down, Michael had typed late into the night, muttering about getting it all on record. But the memo never surfaced. Delaney leaned back in his chair, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling. If Michael was writing a report, someone made sure it never saw daylight. Meanwhile, the whispers about Elena grew darker. Some said she was a manipulator, playing both sides between law enforcement and organized crime. Others insisted she had been silenced because she knew too much. Delaney couldn't shake the suspicion that Michael and Elena's fates were bound together in a knot of betrayal and buried truths. On a rainy evening, Delaney sat across from a retired field agent who had once served under Harrington. The man looked weary, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. "You really want the truth, Delaney?" he asked. "I wouldn't be here otherwise." The man exhaled smoke slowly, eyes narrowing. The Bureau didn't lose Carver. The bureau buried him. Delaney's stomach clenched. You mean Harrington? The man looked away. Names don't matter. What matters is, Carver saw something, wrote it down, and then he snapped his fingers. Gone. Before Delaney could press further, the man stood and walked into the rain, disappearing like a ghost. For Delaney, it was confirmation of what he had long feared. Michael hadn't been a traitor and he hadn't run. He had been silenced, but the question remained, by whom and why? The answers weren't in the Bureau's pristine archives. They were buried in the shadows in half-burned reports, in the haunted faces of men too afraid to speak. And Delaney, battered body and all, was determined to drag those shadows into the light. What he didn't yet know was that Daniel Carver, now a restless, angry teenager, was starting his own search, one that would soon collide with Delaney's in ways neither could control. By 1991, Daniel Carver was 16, and the quiet boy who once stared out classroom windows had hardened into someone unrecognizable. His father's absence had become the central fact of his life, shaping his friendships, his anger, and the way he saw the world. Laura noticed the change most in his eyes. They carried the same intensity Michael once had, an unblinking determination that could turn on anyone, even her. One evening, Laura found him in the attic, surrounded by boxes she had avoided for years. Old files, photographs, and newspaper clippings were spread across the floor like pieces of an unfinished puzzle. Daniel, what are you doing up here? He didn't look up. I'm finding him. Laura's throat tightened. This isn't healthy. Neither is pretending he never existed, Daniel snapped. His voice was deeper now, tinged with resentment. Everyone acts like he vanished into thin air, but there's a reason. There has to be. Laura knelt beside him, trying to gather the papers. You don't understand how dangerous this is. The Bureau? I don't care about the Bureau, he cut her off. They gave up. I won't. The finality in his tone frightened her. At school, Daniel's obsession bled into his behavior. He wrote essays about conspiracy, about corruption and betrayal. Teachers called Laura in for meetings, worried that he was spiraling into paranoia. But Daniel wasn't imagining things. He had discovered names in the clippings, faces in the photographs, fragments of Elena Ruiz's existence. He didn't know who she was yet, only that she had been important to Michael, important enough for the Bureau to erase. Late at night, Daniel copied her name into a notebook, underlining it again and again until the paper tore. Elena, Elena, Elena. Laura tried to shield him, to lock away the remnants of Michael's life, but Daniel always found a way back in. He broke into the study after she padlocked it, memorized file numbers, and tracked down articles at the library. He was no longer searching for his father. He was hunting for the truth. Their arguments grew bitter. Do you even want to know what happened to him? Daniel demanded one night, slamming a folder onto the kitchen table. Laura's hands shook as she poured herself coffee. Of course I do. But knowing won't bring him back. Daniel's jaw tightened. So you'd rather live with lies? Her voice broke. I would rather live in peace. Silence hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Daniel stormed out, the screen door slamming behind him, leaving Laura trembling in the kitchen with tears streaking her face. In the months that followed, Daniel withdrew further from her. He spent hours with a small group of friends who shared his distrust of authority, but even they tired of his fixation. While they talked about girls and college applications, Daniel talked about the FBI, about missing files, about cover-ups. At night, Laura heard him pacing his bedroom, restless, unable to sleep. Sometimes she heard him whispering as though rehearsing questions for a man who would never answer. One evening, she caught him sneaking out with a backpack. Where are you going? Daniel froze at the door. Maryland. Maryland? Her voice cracked. Daniel, you can't. I found something in Dad's old notes. A diner. He met someone there. I need to see it for myself. Laura's chest tightened with panic. You're 16. You don't even drive legally. Daniel's eyes blazed. Neither did he. Not by the rules. If I don't look for him, no one will. For a moment, Laura saw Michael in him, the same fire, the same recklessness. She whispered, almost pleading, don't let him take you. 2. But Daniel was already gone. The son's obsession was no longer a quiet wound. It had become a force, one that would drive him toward people and places he could not yet imagine. And in the shadows, Frank Delaney was following the same trail, their paths destined to collide. It was the winter of 1995 when the silence finally cracked. The woods near the Virginia-Maryland border were quiet that morning, the kind of silence broken only by the crunch of boots over frosted leaves. A hunter named Clyde Peterson had wandered farther than usual, chasing the tracks of a deer that had disappeared into the thicket. He stopped when his boot struck metal. At first he thought it was scrap from an old truck, rusted and buried half in the soil. But as he brushed the dirt away with his gloves, he realized it was a case, a military-style lockbox, weathered but intact. Its hinges creaked as he pried it open with his hunting knife. Inside, beneath layers of dirt-stained cloth, lay an FBI badge. The name glinted faintly through grime and rust. Special Agent Michael Carver. The authorities descended on the woods within hours. Crime scene tape cut through the barren trees. Agents combed the ground, and photographs snapped under flashes of pale winter light. The box contained more than the badge. There was Michael's service pistol, serial number still legible, and most damning of all, a series of photographs. The images were grainy but unmistakable. Michael in plain clothes, sitting in diners, walking in alleys, leaning too close to a woman with dark hair and sharp eyes. Elena Ruiz. The photos told no story outright, but they suggested one. An agent entangled with a woman the Bureau had long denied even existed. News traveled fast. By evening, television screens across Virginia blared the same headline: Missing FBI Agent's Badge Found After 12 Years. At home, Laura sat rigid on the couch as the broadcast replayed. The photographs flickered on the screen, each one like a knife twisting deeper, Michael's face intimate, almost tender as he leaned toward Elena. Beside her, Daniel stared in disbelief. "That's her," he whispered. He had seen Elena's name scratched in old files, had traced it obsessively in his notebooks. Now here she was in flesh and image, proof. Laura's voice broke. "My God, Michael." The doorbell rang minutes later. Reporters crowded the porch, shoving microphones toward her face. "Mrs. Carver, do you believe your husband had a mistress? Do you think he abandoned you?" Daniel shoved the door shut, fury burning in his eyes. They don't know him. They don't know what happened. But Laura could barely breathe. She saw betrayal in every photograph. Her husband's absence was explained not by abduction or silencing, but by choice. In a motel off Interstate 64, Frank Delaney watched the same broadcast with whiskey in hand. He froze when the photographs appeared. Elena Ruiz. The Bureau had scrubbed her from official files, insisted she was a ghost. But ghosts didn't pose in grainy photos with missing agents. Delaney leaned forward, muttering to himself. "So they buried you, Carver. But not deep enough." He knew what the discovery meant. If the badge and gun had been hidden, it wasn't random. Someone had placed them there deliberately, perhaps recently. Why? To be found? To send a message? Or to bury the truth in plain sight? Delaney stubbed out his cigarette, decision made. He would follow the trail wherever it led, even if it dragged him back into the shadows of the Bureau that had already discarded him. The official response was swift, but calculated. Harrington appeared on television, his hair grayer but his tone as clipped as ever. "While the Bureau acknowledges this discovery, we caution the public not to jump to conclusions. Agent Carver's disappearance remains unsolved. These items will be carefully analyzed for forensic evidence." But behind closed doors, files reopened, and whispers turned into quiet storms. Laura tried to shield Daniel from it, but the discovery only deepened his obsession. He pored over the photos, memorizing Elena's face, convinced she held the key to his father's fate. "He wasn't running away from us," Daniel said one night, pacing the living room. "He was meeting her for a reason. Maybe she knew what he was investigating. Maybe she disappeared because she knew too much." Laura pressed a hand to her temple, exhausted. Or maybe he loved her. The words stung them both. By spring, the woods no longer looked quiet. Journalists and investigators trampled the ground where Clyde Peterson had stumbled upon the box, hunting for more. Nobody was found. No clear answers emerged. Only questions multiplied. Why had the box been buried there? Who had placed it? And why had it surfaced after 12 long years? The discovery shocked the investigators. But for Laura and Daniel, it did more. It reopened the wound, rawer than before. And somewhere in the shadows of old Bureau corridors, Frank Delaney sharpened his focus. The badge and the photos were not the ending. They were the beginning of a much darker truth. The photographs spread across the evidence table like shards of glass. Each image bore the faint grain of surveillance. Michael Carver with a woman whose presence seemed to pull light toward her and then swallow it whole. Elena Ruiz. To the bureau, the name was both familiar and forbidden. Frank Delaney leaned over the table, the photographs trembling slightly in his hands. He had heard her name whispered years ago in corridors where men lowered their voices before speaking. Elena was rumored to be a liaison of sorts, part fixer, part lover, part phantom in the bureau's ugliest secrets. But the files were scrubbed, her existence denied. And yet here she was, captured with Carver as if daring them to remember. The investigation into Elena began quietly. Harrington assigned 2 younger agents to track her background, though he gave no details in official memos. What they found was a trail of smoke. Elena Ruiz appeared in scattered police records from the late 70s. A bar fight in Baltimore, a traffic stop in D.C. Then, in 1979, her name surfaced in an FBI intelligence report tying her to a Cuban-born crime figure, Antonio Valdez, a man suspected of trafficking arms through the eastern seaboard. After that, her trail went dark. At home, Daniel Carver was unraveling the same thread. He had taped Elena's photo from the broadcast to the wall above his desk. The woman's eyes stared back at him, sharp, calculating, unsmiling. He read everything he could: library archives, old newspapers, whispered rumors from people who claimed to remember her. The more he learned, the more convinced he became. Elena wasn't his father's mistress. She was his ally, don't you see? He pressed one night, pacing the living room as Laura sat silent on the couch. If Dad was meeting her, it was because she had information. Maybe about Valdez. Maybe about the Bureau itself. He wasn't betraying us, he was protecting us. Laura rubbed her temples, exhausted by the years of grief compounded now by conspiracy. Or maybe, she whispered, he was protecting himself. Daniel shook his head violently. No, he loved us. He wouldn't just walk away. The conviction in his voice was unshakable. Delaney's approach was colder. He drove to Baltimore, a city where Elena's name had been little more than a rumor 2 decades ago. He sat in backroom bars with men who remembered Valdez, men whose eyes darted nervously when Delaney asked about Elena Ruiz. She was dangerous, one old dock worker muttered, his voice a gravelly whisper, not loud, not flashy. But people followed her. Even Valdez, he listened to her. And when she disappeared, things got worse. More violence. Like she was the one keeping him in check, Delaney pressed. And Carver? Did she know him? The man hesitated, then drained his glass. If she did, it didn't end well. Back in Virginia, the Bureau's analysts confirmed what Delaney already suspected. The photos in the case weren't random surveillance. The evidence was taken by someone watching Michael, not by Michael himself. Which meant someone inside the Bureau had been tracking him and Elena together. But why bury the photos with his badge and gun? Theories swirled. Perhaps Elena had lured Michael into Valdez's world. Perhaps she had been his informant. Or perhaps she had betrayed them both. For Delaney, the questions cut deeper. Who wanted the Bureau to forget her? And who wanted her remembered now? Laura tried to shield Daniel from the noise, but the photos had already poisoned the silence of their home. He carried Elena's image with him, tucked into his notebook, as if she were the missing key to his father's ghost. Sometimes, Laura caught him staring at the photo with something like reverence, almost as though he believed Elena was still alive. By spring, a whisper spread quietly through the Bureau. Elena Ruiz might not have vanished at all. One lead, fragile and uncertain, placed her in Miami in 1989, under another name. For Laura, it meant nothing but more torment. For Daniel, it was fire poured onto dry kindling. And for Frank Delaney, it was proof of what he had always known. Michael Carver's story hadn't ended in 1983. It had only just begun. The spring of 1995 brought no relief to Laura Carver's house. If anything, the air grew heavier, as if each discovery about Michael's past pushed the walls closer together. Daniel spent late nights in his room with the blinds drawn, notes and photographs pinned to the wall in a frantic mosaic. Threads of yarn stretched between them. Michael, Elena, Valdez, the Bureau. Lines of connection only he seemed to understand. Laura knocked one night, balancing a plate of food in her hands. You need to eat, she said softly. I'm busy, Daniel. She placed the plate on his desk. This isn't living. He turned, his eyes burning with a conviction that frightened her. It's the only way I can live. Don't you get it? If I don't finish what Dad started, then he's gone forever. Just another cold file in a drawer. Her voice cracked. And if you lose yourself in the process. But Daniel had already turned back to the wall. Meanwhile, Frank Delaney was circling the same storm. The discovery of Michael's badge and photos had reignited something inside him, a dangerous curiosity that the Bureau had once tried to extinguish. He spent long nights in motel rooms, papers scattered across cheap bedsheets tracing the outlines of Elena Ruiz's shadow. The whispers he collected pointed to Miami, but the trail was too clean, too carefully obscured. Someone with power had buried her existence, and Delaney's instincts told him the Bureau wasn't just complicit, it was central. But what unsettled him most wasn't the Bureau. It was the boy. Delaney first heard of Daniel by accident. A retired colleague mentioned in passing that Carver's son was asking questions he shouldn't. At first, Delaney dismissed it. But when he caught sight of the boy himself, outside a public library in Alexandria, clutching a notebook thick with scribbles, he stopped in his tracks. The resemblance was uncanny. Daniel had Michael's jawline, his sharp eyes, his restless posture. He looked like a ghost brought back in teenage form. Delaney stayed in his car, watching as Daniel flipped through microfilm newspapers with the intensity of a man decades older. It was dangerous, reckless, and exactly what Michael would have done. For Delaney, it was more than a coincidence. It was inevitable. That night, Delaney phoned an old contact. "The kid's digging too deep," he muttered. On the other end, silence. Then a weary sigh. "So are you, Frank. You should know better by now." "I knew Carver," Delaney pressed. "He didn't vanish for no reason. And this boy, he's not going to stop. If we don't get ahead of it, someone else will." The line clicked dead. Daniel's search finally crossed into dangerous territory when he slipped into a closed records office at his high school, using a spare key he'd stolen from the janitor. He wasn't looking for school records, he was looking for access to the county archive machine. For 2 hours, under the dim hum of fluorescent lights, he printed old arrest reports with Elena's name, Valdez's name, and his father's. He knew someone was watching him when he stepped back into the parking lot. A man leaning against a dark sedan lit a cigarette. He didn't speak at first, just watched the boy. Finally, he said, "You're Michael's kid." Daniel froze. "Who are you?" The man took a drag, smoke curling into the night. "Someone who knew him. Someone who's been asking the same questions you're asking." Daniel's grip on the folder tightened. "Then tell me what happened." The man shook his head. "Not here, not yet. You're playing with fire." "Then let me burn," Daniel snapped. Delaney smiled faintly. Michael's son, indeed. Later that night, Daniel sat in his room, replaying the encounter. He didn't know the man's name, but the look in his eyes told him everything. He had answers. And answers meant hope. For Delaney, the brief conversation confirmed what he had feared. The boy wasn't chasing shadows anymore. He was standing in the middle of the storm. In a bureau office across town, Harrington reviewed the photographs again, his expression unreadable. He had spent years burying Michael Carver's memory, and now the past was clawing its way back through the next generation. He closed the file and whispered to himself, "The boy has to be stopped." The return of secrets was no longer confined to old files and buried boxes. It was alive, breathing, and moving through the bloodline of Michael Carver himself, and both Daniel and Delaney were about to learn that some truths refused to stay buried. Frank Delaney had learned long ago that the Bureau's corridors held two sets of truths, the ones written in files and the ones spoken in whispers, and it was the whispers that mattered now. He sat in a dingy motel outside Arlington, papers scattered across the bed. Every thread led back to the same knot, Elena Ruiz. She wasn't just some shadow in Michael Carver's disappearance. She was the pivot, but why had Harrington, of all people, spent years erasing her from official memory? Delaney lit another cigarette, the smoke curling toward the ceiling. He thought of the boy, Daniel, his fire, his recklessness. It was only a matter of time before that recklessness got him killed. Meanwhile, Daniel was growing bolder. His chance meeting with Delaney hadn't scared him. It had ignited him. He filled notebooks with questions. Why Elena? Why Valdez? Why bury the badge and photos after 12 years? But with every discovery, the danger sharpened. He noticed cars idling longer outside his school. Twice he caught the same man in a gray coat near the library. His mother brushed off his fears, but Daniel knew surveillance when he saw it. One evening, he confronted Laura in the kitchen, slamming down a folder of printouts. "They're watching me," Laura's face paled. "Daniel, no, listen. Whoever made Dad disappear is still out there, and now they're coming after me." Her hands trembled as she gripped the counter. "You're seeing ghosts." Daniel leaned forward, eyes fierce. "Then why do the ghosts drive government cars?" Inside Bureau headquarters, Harrington stood before a closed-door committee. The photographs of Michael and Elena were spread across the long mahogany table. "We can't allow this to spiral," Harrington said coldly. "Carver compromised himself. Ruiz compromised him further. That's all anyone needs to know." One of the committee members, a man with tired eyes, shifted uncomfortably. "And the boy?" Harrington's jaw tightened. "The boy is his father's son, which makes him a liability." The room fell silent. No one argued. The decision had already been made. Delaney wasn't blind to the tightening noose. He caught the same tale twice in 1 week. Bureau men in unmarked sedans. They weren't watching him to protect him, they were warning him. Stop digging. But Delaney had already gone too far. He uncovered an old memo buried deep in the archives, unsigned but damning. It referenced an operation codenamed Night Glass, a covert sting aimed at dismantling Valdez's network in 1983. The lead informant? Elena Ruiz. And the agent overseeing the operation? Michael Carver. Delaney exhaled slowly, the paper trembling in his hands. This was it, the connection no one wanted found. Michael hadn't been straying. He had been working on an unsanctioned operation, perhaps one Harrington himself had ordered buried. If true, Michael's disappearance wasn't about betrayal. It was about silencing him. That same night, Daniel stumbled across the same code name while rifling through a set of records he shouldn't have had access to. Night Glass. He underlined it again and again in his notebook until the ink bled through. When Delaney appeared outside his school the next day, Daniel didn't run. He walked straight up to him. "You knew my father," Daniel said, voice steady. Delaney nodded once. "And now I know they're trying to erase you the way they erased him." Daniel's breath caught, equal parts fear and fury. "Then help me." Delaney studied the boy, the ghost of Michael staring back at him through those eyes. Finally he muttered, "Meet me tonight, old train yard east of town. Bring nothing you can't afford to lose." That evening, Laura sat alone, unaware of the meeting her son was walking into. She stared at Michael's photograph on the mantel, her heart heavy. "If you could see him now," she whispered, "you'd know he's breaking himself to find you." The train yard was silent, rusted metal skeletons looming against the night sky. Daniel arrived first, clutching his notebook like a weapon. Delaney stepped from the shadows minutes later, a folder under his arm. He handed Daniel a single sheet. "Night Glass. That's what your father was working on. And that's what got him killed, or worse." Daniel scanned the page, his pulse pounding. "So Elena, she wasn't his mistress?" Delaney shook his head. "She was his informant, his partner, maybe more. But what matters is, she knew something big, something Valdez wanted buried, and something the Bureau didn't want exposed." Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. "Then she's the key." Delaney exhaled smoke into the cold night. "If she's alive, yes. But finding her will put both of us in the crosshairs." A noise echoed from the far end of the yard. Footsteps. Both froze. Delaney grabbed Daniel's arm. "They've found us." As shadows moved among the derelict trains, the truth was no longer just a puzzle of photographs and rumors. It was alive, hunting them. And for the first time, Daniel realized his father's fate wasn't a mystery to be solved. It was a war he had just stepped into. The train yard encounter marked a turning point. Daniel hadn't been naive before, but now he understood the danger in tangible ways. In the way Delaney pulled him into the shadows, in the glint of flashlights sweeping across rusted boxcars, in the low murmur of men who moved with military precision. Whoever they were, they hadn't come to scare them. They had come to silence. Delaney shoved Daniel behind an abandoned freight container. "Don't move until I say." His voice was calm, but his grip was iron. Through a gap, Daniel caught glimpses. 3 men in plain clothes, no badges, no names. Bureau, maybe. Maybe worse. One of them carried a suppressed pistol. Delaney cursed under his breath. They're escalating. He waited until the men turned deeper into the yard, then hauled Daniel up by the collar. They ran, boots pounding against gravel, until they reached Delaney's car parked 2 blocks away. Neither spoke until they were on the highway, headlights cutting through the darkness. Only then did Daniel exhale. They knew we'd be there. Delaney's jaw tightened, which means someone's feeding them, someone inside. At home, Laura's worry grew into dread. Daniel had started disappearing at night, returning with hollow eyes and bruises on his arms. He avoided her questions, brushing her off with a teenager's defiance. But Laura could feel the noose tightening too, even if she didn't yet understand who was holding the rope. That evening, a knock rattled the door. Harrington stood on her porch, older now, his presence commanding and suffocating all at once. "Mrs. Carver," he said smoothly. "May I come in?" She hesitated. The last time she had seen him was at Michael's funeral. That wasn't. The empty coffin and hollow condolences. She hated the way he said her name, like she was still a subject in his file. "I don't think that's a good idea." His smile was practiced, brittle. "Then I'll be brief. Daniel's activities have drawn attention. He's playing with fire, and fire consumes more than just the hand that holds it." Laura's voice shook. "If you're so worried, then stop watching him. Stop sending cars to sit outside our house." Harrington's smile didn't waver. "I'm not the one you should be worried about." And with that, he turned and walked into the night, leaving Laura trembling in the doorway. In the motel, Delaney spread documents across the table for Daniel. "Look, Operation Nightglass was sanctioned at the highest levels. Harrington's name is all over it, though never directly. That's how he works, through shadows." Daniel leaned forward. "So Harrington had my father killed?" Delaney's eyes narrowed. "Careful. You don't say something like that without proof. But yes, if Michael got too close to the truth, Harrington had motive. And Elena Ruiz? She was the piece they couldn't control." Daniel's fists clenched. "Then we find her." Delaney studied him, the fire in his eyes. He saw Michael again, the same refusal to bow. "Finding her means choosing sides, kid. And once you choose, there's no going back." Daniel didn't hesitate. "I chose the day he disappeared." The trap tightened further when Laura discovered her phone line had been tapped. She had picked it up late at night and heard the faint click, the static delay. She slammed the receiver down, her heart racing. She knew then Daniel wasn't imagining the surveillance. The next day, she confronted him. "I can't keep living like this. Whoever they are, they'll come for you, and I'll lose you the way I lost him." Daniel's face softened for a rare moment. "You won't lose me. Not this time." But Laura saw the truth in his eyes. He was already gone, walking the same path as Michael. Inside the bureau, Harrington convened a private meeting. His aides laid out reports of Delaney's movements, Daniel's library records, and Laura's phone calls. "They're closing in," one aide warned. "Then it's time," Harrington said flatly. "Delaney has outlived his usefulness. The boy is too close. Make it look clean." The room was silent. Orders like that didn't need clarification. That night, Delaney and Daniel were ambushed, leaving the diner where they had met to trade notes. A black sedan cut across the lot, headlights blinding. Men spilled out, 2, then 3, weapons drawn. Delaney shoved Daniel down as bullets cracked against the diner wall. He fired back, his old instincts sharp, but it was 3 against 1. Daniel scrambled, heart hammering, until he saw one of the men's faces illuminated by the flash of gunfire. It wasn't a stranger. It was someone in a bureau windbreaker. An active agent. Daniel froze, the realization burning through him. The bureau wasn't protecting them. The bureau was the one hunting them. Delaney dragged him toward the alley, shouting, "No, move, kid." They escaped by inches, vanishing into the night, but the truth had crystallized. This wasn't a conspiracy theory. This wasn't paranoia, it was betrayal, written in gunpowder and blood. By the time they regrouped in Delaney's car, Daniel's hands were shaking, his breath ragged. "They tried to kill us," he whispered. Delaney's face was grim. "No, they tried to erase you? Just like your father." And in her darkened house, Laura sat alone, unaware of the gunfire miles away, unaware that the last pieces of her husband's life were converging into a storm. Her son could no longer escape. The trap was closing fast, and this time no one would walk away untouched. The night after the ambush, Daniel sat in Delaney's car, his body still trembling with adrenaline. The world outside blurred into streaks of rain and neon, but his mind was fixed on one truth. The Bureau had tried to kill them. Not strangers. Not criminals. The Bureau. Delaney's knuckles were white against the steering wheel. "They're scared," he muttered. "That means we're close." Daniel turned to him, voice hoarse. "Close to what?" Delaney's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. "The truth your father died for." The next step came not from the Bureau, but from Elena Ruiz herself. Delaney had suspected she was alive, but suspicion turned to certainty when an anonymous envelope arrived at his motel. Inside was a single photograph, recent and sharp. Elena, older now, standing outside a Miami marina. No note, no explanation, just proof. Daniel stared at the photo, heart pounding. "She's alive," Delaney nodded grimly. "And she's either our salvation or the last nail in the coffin." They found her 2 days later in Miami, living under the name Teresa Morales. She was cautious but not surprised when Delaney and Daniel appeared at her door. Her eyes lingered on Daniel first. "You're Michael's boy." Daniel's throat tightened. "Did you know him?" Elena's gaze dropped. "I loved him." The words hung in the air, shattering Laura's long-denied fears. But there was no lust in her tone, no triumph. "Only grief." Delaney stepped forward. "Then tell us what happened." Elena hesitated, then opened the door wider. "You'd better come inside." Her apartment was sparse, the blinds drawn, a life lived in shadows. She poured 3 glasses of water and sat at the table. "Michael was my handler," she began. "But more than that, he was my partner. Nightglass wasn't just about Valdez. It was about the Bureau's own rot. Valdez wasn't working alone. He had men inside, feeding him intel, letting his shipments pass. Harrington was one of them." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "You're saying Harrington was corrupt?" Elena nodded. "And your father found proof. Proof that could have burned Harrington and 6 others. He planned to take it to the justice. That's when he vanished." Delaney's voice was low. "Vanished. Or was made to vanish." Elena's eyes glistened. "They came for him the night we were supposed to meet. I was late. When I arrived, his car was there. But he wasn't. I ran. I've been running ever since." Daniel's chest ached. "So you don't know what they did to him?" Elena reached across the table, gripping his hand. "All I know is he never betrayed you. Not once. He died trying to protect you and your mother." The dam inside Daniel broke. For years he had feared his father was a coward, a traitor, a man who walked away. Now the truth was worse, but cleaner. Michael Carver had been a target because he refused to bend. Delaney leaned forward. "Do you still have the proof?" Elena nodded slowly. "Copies. Hidden. Michael's originals are gone, but what I saved is enough to bury Harrington." Daniel's eyes burned with a fierce, dangerous hope. "Then let's end this." The final confrontation came 2 nights later, in a warehouse near the docks where Elena had stored the files. Delaney, Daniel, and Elena moved quickly, retrieving a lockbox from beneath a false wall. Inside were papers, photographs, even recordings, documents linking Harrington directly to Valdez's network. But they weren't alone. The sound of boots echoed through the warehouse. Harrington stepped from the shadows, flanked by armed men. His hair was grayer, but his eyes were the same, cold, precise. "I warned you," he said, voice steady. Michael didn't listen. "Now you've dragged his son into the same grave." Daniel stood tall, the lockbox clutched in his arms. "You killed him." Harrington's expression didn't waver. He killed himself the moment he thought truth mattered more than loyalty. Delaney raised his weapon steady despite his years. "You won't bury this, Harrington." "Not again." Harrington's lips curved into a thin smile. "I don't need to. No one believes disgraced agents, runaway informants, or angry sons. The Bureau believes me." Elena stepped forward, her voice like steel. "Not when the world hears what's in this box." For a tense moment, the warehouse was silent, the air heavy with the weight of 12 years. Then gunfire erupted. Delaney shoved Daniel to the ground, returning fire. Elena sprinted toward the back exit, clutching the lockbox. Harrington's men fell one by one, but not before a bullet struck Delaney in the shoulder, spinning him to the floor. Daniel crawled to him, panic in his voice. "Frank," Delaney gritted his teeth.
"Go, protect the files!"
"Protect the truth. That's what your father died for." By the time the shooting stopped, Harrington was gone, vanishing into the night like smoke. Elena and Daniel escaped with the lockbox, Delaney limping beside them. Days later, the documents hit the press. Harrington's empire of secrecy collapsed in a storm of headlines and indictments. The Bureau tried to shield itself, but the evidence was too strong. Harrington disappeared, a fugitive in the shadows he once controlled. For Laura, the truth was both liberation and torment. She stood in her kitchen, newspaper spread on the counter, tears streaming down her face. Michael hadn't abandoned her. He had been taken because he refused to betray what he believed. Daniel returned home, scarred but resolute. He placed his father's badge, the one from the buried case, on the mantel. "You didn't vanish," he whispered. "They tried to erase you, but now the world knows." Elena disappeared again, her role complete. Delaney faded back into anonymity. His debt to Michael finally paid. And Daniel Carver, son of the vanished agent, carried forward the legacy his father had died to protect. The reckoning had come at last. It had cost blood, love, and years of silence. But the truth, once buried, had clawed its way back to the surface. And though Michael Carver never returned, his ghost no longer haunted the shadows. It lived instead in the fire of a son who refused to let him be forgotten.